Good morning, everyone. Welcome officially to welcome to Thursday.
It's not there.
It's what? Oh, it's not there. Hang on, you're right. I just got to change the output video monitor. There we go. But interestingly, the stream can see it, so I can control what is streamed and what is on. Yeah, fancy. I'm pretty fancy, with my technology over here. So good morning to all of you. Let's just kind of jump right in. I have some things to share with you, but maybe I'll wait until there's more people here. Unadi's here, so good morning, Unadi. Kayla's here. Hello, Kayla. Good morning. And Jesse's here. Morning, Jesse. Yesterday. Yesterday we started talking about racism, right? And I asked you a number of questions just to kind of get us going about what race was and what race were you and who decides and can you change races and is it meaningful, etc. And we'll talk about these a little bit more maybe today, some of these questions anyway. But some of them were answered, I think, yesterday, right? I'll jump over that for now. The first thing I wanted to point out to you is kind of making a separation between race and ethnicity. Right? So ethnicity, of course, has to do with your culture, your language, the history of your people, the sort of, social norms and society that you come from. But race is a different thing, right? Race is, and as you can see here, I've taken some care to say it's a social distinction, right? So it's not a biological reality, right? It's not a thing that makes humans different. It's a social distinction, right? It's something that we identify as important as humans, right? And it's also interesting to think about, well, I'll say that in a second. So people have sort of created racial categories based on some physical characteristics, right? And so the color of our skin, the shape of our eyes, or how our hair grows, or sort of the shape of our face or some of our facial features, those are kind of racial markers, right? Those are what people use to kind of divide people into different races. But it is interesting the kind of things that we don't, many societies see these things as meaningful differences, but then there are some differences that aren't. Like, why don't we categorize people by eye color? Right? We really don't. We notice people's eye color, right? But there's really no significance to it, right? There's no stereotypes about blue-eyed or brown-eyed people. I know we talk about Jane Elliott's class with the kids quite a bit, but there's really there's no kind of social meaning attached to eye color, right? Some eye colors are nice, some are just kind of normal, whatever. But there's really no stereotypes or meaning associated with it. So it's kind of interesting to think about, the physical characteristics that humans have said, oh, this makes a difference and this doesn't, right? Skin color makes a difference, but yet eye color, nobody cares, right? Strange. But anyway, so we said race is a social distinction, and I went on to kind of explain to you that, many people think race is a biological reality, and to some degree that makes sense because the way we divide people into races has to do with their physical bodies, right? And of course, our physical bodies are determined by biology, they're determined by our genetics. But what I tried to explain to you yesterday is that out of 200,000 or 300,000 genes and billions of little chemicals tied into our DNA strand, what you'll find is that the genetic differences that are associated with skin color and eye shape and all that stuff, they're really just a few genes, right? And yes, people coming from particular parts of the world all have those genes, but they're just not that big of a deal, right? They just don't make that much difference between us. And again, we're visual creatures. We understand the world through our eyes, and so often we see someone of a different race and we think, oh, they look really different from me, therefore they must be very different from me. But in reality, they're they're almost genetically identical to you. There's just not that much difference between humans, right? And so, again, biological races aren't really a reality for humans. We have some genes that come to us from certain parts of the world. Some of them are kind of environmentally adaptive, and we've inherited those, but they don't really make a difference, right? There's really no difference between humans in that way. So those genetic differences between us, for the most part, are superficial, right? They don't really mean anything. But again, that doesn't mean, of course, that race is not a thing, right? Because we know that humans socially construct their reality, and because of that, things that humans believe to be true have power, right? And so, again, if people think that racial differences are real and meaningful, then they will be real and meaningful because that's what everybody believes to be true, right? So I talked very quickly about dominant group and minoritized group here, and we use the term peoples of color to describe non-white people. Again, it's not a perfect term because it includes all kinds of different people that have different experiences, but it just helps us talk about these sort of things. Did you have a question there, Eunice? No, you okay? Right, so we started reading this article, Understanding Racism, yesterday, and you told me, in number one, you told me that race emerged as a category kind of in conjunction with colonization, right? So before colonization, race wasn't really a thing, right? It wasn't really important or meaningful. Granted, most societies probably weren't multiracial anyway because people weren't moving around that much. And so, if you were living in, let's say, Britain in the 1600s, the odds of seeing a black person were basically zero. So, people didn't really need to, think about or identify race because, again, most communities weren't multiracial at the time. But again, as colonizers started to go out and explore and then sort of conquer various parts of the world, they started encountering different types of people. But, describing people is one thing, but the kind of ideology of race came along with colonization, right? And the need to sort of justify why you can go into someone else's country and take all of their stuff and treat them horribly, right? That seems like an awful thing to do. But again, colonizers and explorers, they kind of convinced themselves that they were better, right? That these indigenous people or, I guess whatever country they went to, they were indigenous, but the people from the country they were colonizing were somehow less than them, right? They were more primitive, they were savages, they were unintelligent, they were somehow less than human, right? And again, if you think that people are less than human, it becomes easier to treat them poorly, right? And that's kind of exactly what happens with colonizers and explorers. They see the people they encounter as less than them, less civilized, less human, and so it justifies taking their things, right? And again, I said that it actually got to the point where it was sort of described as the white man's burden, quote unquote, the white man's burden. And so not only were white people going around the world colonizing and sort of taking people's things, but they felt it was their burden, their duty to civilize these people, right? So they would encounter people living maybe a more simple lifestyle, and it was like, oh, this is our burden. We have to, do a good thing and raise these people up, right? Which of course is complete, what. But that was kind of the feeling of the day, right? They weren't doing something really bad. In fact, they were doing something good, right? They were civilizing these people, whether or not they wanted to be civilized or not, or whatever that means. But so again, this ideology of race comes out of colonialism, but it persists afterwards, right? And I think we kind of got to number 4, and so I'd like to look at number 4 because I know that it shows up in, I'm just going to open the reading here, and maybe you can too. Readings and worksheets. Where is it? There it is, Understanding Racism. Because the beliefs shared by race-based societies are just right on, right kind of at the top right of the second page, right? So there's A, B, C, D, and E. So what's A there, Eunice? Do you have it in front of you? Yeah, it's that one right there. So I'm gonna try and make this just a little bit bigger. Yeah. So these are the beliefs of race-based societies, right? So societies that believe race is a real, meaningful thing think that racial differences originate in biology and that physical characteristics and behaviors, interestingly enough, are accurate indicators of race. Right? What do we know about that? Is that true? Well, certainly are the things that we identify people by race. Those are biological for sure. But are there real biological differences between, say, you and me? We're different races, yes. But are we really biologically different? Not really, right? And look at that. Interestingly, that physical characteristics and behaviors. So, do you and I behave a certain way because we're a member of our own races? Do I behave like a white person? And if I do, is it biological? No, right? My behavior is not biological. We talked about that right at the beginning of the class, right? We said that most of human behavior is learned, right? It's through socialization. We're not really hardwired with very much at all. So, yeah, this one is kind of not entirely true, right? True that the things that we identify as racial differences are biological, but behaviors certainly aren't. Each race has a distinct culture that is also linked to biology. What do you think about that one? No. Not true? No. So you're saying if I went to China and I adopted a little Chinese baby, brought it home, me and my partner raised this little baby, this little Chinese baby, would this baby be culturally Chinese? Would they be speaking Mandarin and walking around and doing Chinese things, whatever those are? No. No. It's ridiculous, right? Because again, human behavior is mostly taught, right? Chinese culture is passed on usually by Chinese people, right? If I take a Chinese baby and adopt them and raise them here in Canada, they're going to be Canadian. Yeah, they're going to, of course, look Chinese because that's where their genes come from, but they're going to be Canadian, right? They're going to be raised by my partner and I, she's not Chinese either. I guess you might need to know that, but she's not. So this one's not really true either, right? Culture is not linked to biology, right? Culture is learned. What about this one? C. Racial differences are meaningful and unchangeable. So, I guess that means is that if you belong to a certain race, you will always belong to a certain race, and all of those things about you that are assumed about you for being part of that race, that's not changeable.
Plus, there's plastic surgery.
Yeah, I guess there's the Michael Jackson example, right? So yeah, I guess with surgery, some things are changeable, but they're kind of saying that who you are is determined by your race, right? Who you are as a person is determined. Good morning. Is determined by your race, and you can't change that, right? You can't change that. Race-based societies say that some races are naturally inferior. Is that true?
What's
Less. The opposite of superior. Are some races better than others?
no?
No, right? And in fact, we know that races aren't even a thing. So one, one race cannot be better than another because races don't exist in humans. So that can't be true in two ways, right? And finally here, racial categories should be written into political, legal, and social systems, right? So this is the last piece. Because race-based societies believe that race is a real thing, they believe that people are really actually different according to race, and that cannot change, that you need to create a society that is organized by race, right? That has maybe different laws or different rights or different privileges depending on race, because people are actually different according to their race, right? That's what race-based societies, those are the things that they believe, right? And some of these apply to Canada and the United States currently. Some of those things apply to Canada and the United States in the past, for sure. But of course, let me just switch back here. But of course, what have scientists confirmed about race? What do we know about race?
There's no race.
Yeah.
It's not a real thing.
It's not a it's not a real thing according to biology, right? So you can see here, yeah, there's no basis for human races. We're almost all the same, right? And in the ways, this is an interesting these are interesting numbers here. Most of our differences occur between individuals, right? So the way in which Eunice, if we took your genetic, if we sequenced your DNA and if we sequenced mine, the ways in which you're different from me are different simply just because you're a different person. You're a different human being. There's only 5 or 10% that are differences that have to do with where you come from in the world and where I come from. So again, that's nothing, right? That's really nothing. And here, this is an interesting stat too. There's more genetic variation within one tribe of wild chimpanzees than within all existing humans. That is unbelievable, right? So a group of chimpanzees is more genetically diverse than all humans are. Unbelievable. So again, we are not so different, us humans, at least not in a biological way. Say that what? Well, that's the thing. So here we're talking about DNA, right? So anything that is biologically coded for in your DNA is just not that different between you and me. Now, we are different, of course, in terms of our life experiences, right? We are different in terms of our culture and our socialization and our religion, right? Those things change the way we think and behave and feel about things. So those can be different, right? But biologically speaking, if you think about it, we're all MacBooks, right? We are all humans are Apple computers, and we might be running different software, but the hardware is the same.
Well, we kind of think the same, even though we're from different cultures, we think like the same way.
Yeah, and that's. Sorry, close that, and I'm going to go back in front of the computer so people can hear me. That's true. We all, and I'm going to get my glasses. That's true, Dunya. We all. Oh, I got them already. That's one of the interesting things about culture is that no matter what culture you belong to, or even like what religion you belong to, often cultures and religions kind of operate in kind of predictable ways, right? And so even if you're running, if you're running a different operating system, let's say, so Dunya, you're from Syria, yes? Okay, so you're running Syrian OS, right? And I'm from Canada, so I'm running Canada OS, right? So those are different operating systems, right? They have kind of different beliefs and values in them. But the way in which those operating systems are written is not so different, right? So the sort of building blocks of culture and how cultures operate are somewhat consistent, right? So even though you have different experiences and you might believe different things than me and you might see the world a little bit differently, your culture and my culture operate in a similar way, right? And again, we're both running our softwares on similar hardware. And not only that, but now that you're in Canada, your original software is kind of getting updated, right? It's getting kind of new things written into it as you stay in Canada and you kind of, maybe your values change a little bit or maybe you see things a little different. And so that happens as well, right? So, yeah, I mean, cultural differences are real, right, and meaningful. And sometimes there's, conflicts between cultures because they see the world differently or they value things differently. But still, humans are remarkably similar, right? Remarkably similar. So the article kind of goes into talking about these three different types of racism, and then it goes on to talk about Aboriginals or Indigenous people. Can I give you a few minutes just to read over that section again, because I feel like we might have got about halfway through that article and then, but not all the way through. Is that right?
Which part?
Well, I thought I would give you just some time to read over the section that answers those questions, and so I think that starts on what page is that? It starts on the third page, I guess, the forms of racism. So can I just give you 5 or 6 minutes to read over that again, just to refresh? Yeah? Okay. All right, so let me just put a few minutes on the clock here, and I'll let you read over that again. Sorry, Dunya, did you say something? The name of the article is it says FS Understanding Racism. It's in Microsoft Teams, of course. And so I'll just give you a few minutes, maybe to start reading at page 3 and just refresh your memory a little bit. Okay, can we talk about this? All right. So, three kind of types of racism, if you will, or kind of categories of racism. What is this epistemic racism? This is kind of tricky, but what is it? Okay.
It explores questions such as how knowledge is acquired and what assumptions are made in the historical development.
Right. That thing, yeah. Yeah, so epistemic racism here has to do with kind of where racial ideas come from, right? Why do we believe the things that we believe about people from different races or different cultures in this case, right? Where do those stereotypes come from, and how are they kind of used to benefit the dominant group and to sort of exploit or limit the lives of the minoritized group, right? So in this case, it just has to do with where do these ideas come from, right? And how are they used? Does that make sense? Where do stereotypes come from? How are they used? Okay. What about the second one? I think is relational racism, right? What's relational racism? Yeah, so it's kind of racism that occurs or discriminatory behavior that occurs between people kind of in their daily life, right? So this is probably the type of racism that maybe we're most familiar with, right? So somebody tells a racist joke, or somebody spreads a racist stereotype, or somebody discriminates based on race. That's kind of everyday relational racism, right? That's kind of the easiest one to see, and I think kind of the easiest one to sort of understand, right? And the last one gets two terms. The wording for it changes back and forth, and I'm not sure why. So here it's called structural racism. I think you'll hear most people call it systemic racism, but as far as I'm aware, they're the same thing. Okay, so what is structural racism or systemic racism? It's what? Yeah. So this is a trickier one. Okay, structural racism or systemic racism is a trickier one because, again, it has to do with how society works. Okay, so the idea here is that society is kind of built or designed in a way that benefits some people and disadvantages others, right? And nobody really has to do anything to have this happen, okay? So imagine this, if you will, because it's a little bit easier to think about this. So when we were talking about ableism, we said that we kind of live in a world for able-bodied people, for the most part, right? And we've made some accommodations for people with physical disabilities, right? So we have elevators and lifts, we have ramps, right, on the bus. We have automatically opening doors, right? You just press the button and the door opens. We've got those curb cuts, right? When you go down the curb, it's kind of cut away, so it's a smooth transition onto the road. We have all these little accommodations, but imagine a world where we didn't have any of those, okay? There's no accommodations for people in wheelchairs or people with physical disabilities, okay? Can you imagine that? Okay. Now, you, of course, would wake up in this world that had no accommodations, and you would kind of go about your daily life, right? You'd go to school, you'd go and meet your friends, you'd go home, you'd go wherever you want, and you wouldn't really think anything of it, right? And of course, people who had physical disabilities would really struggle because there'd be no, it would be really difficult for them to get around. But would you be doing anything wrong just by living your life? Would you be a horrible person? No. No, you wouldn't, right? You were just born into a society and a world where society's designed for you, right? And you sort of go about your daily business and you live your life, right? And it's no big deal. You're not doing anything wrong. And structural racism or systemic racism is like that, right? So society is kind of designed in such a way to benefit the dominant group and sometimes to challenge or to restrict the rights of the minoritized group. And it doesn't really matter so much what anyone does or doesn't do, right? Because this is just how society works, right? This is what the laws are, this is what the policies are, this is what the social norms are. This is the things that society thinks are cool and the things that society thinks are not cool. And so you can live in a country with systemic racism and you don't really have to do anything to have that happen, right? And it's also very difficult to kind of do anything about as one person because it's very difficult to change all of society, right?
Or even like systemic racism. The one like the country is apartheid.
Yeah, it means that overall, the way that the country works benefits people of one race while disadvantaging people of another race. And it's sometimes it's very easy to see, right? So if we go back to South Africa in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, you'll see a system of apartheid, right? So you'll see that white people have political and social power, and they are working very hard to make sure that black South Africans don't have any of that, right? And so, in South Africa, it was very apparent what was going on, right? There was the structural racism or the systemic racism was very clear. You could not miss it. There were schools and beaches and water fountains for white people and schools and beaches and water fountains for black people, right? Everything was separated, and the people who had power in the government were all white, right? The people who had money and riches were pretty much all white. Right? So you could really clearly see that the system was benefiting white people and working against black people. So that one's kind of a very obvious example, but lots of countries have this sort of thing happening, but again, it's much more subtle, right? It's less obvious, right? And to some degree, we do have that still occurring in Canada in some ways with Indigenous people, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So lots of countries have an issue with systemic racism or structural racism. The trick is that sometimes it's very obvious and sometimes it's a little less obvious. In a place like Canada, it's not quite so obvious. Right? In apartheid South Africa, yeah, you can't miss it, right? It's very, very obvious. Never heard of it? There's kind of a long history. It was South Africa was colonized by the Dutch, I believe, by people from Netherlands. Some of the colonists kind of stayed on and formed kind of a government in South Africa, and over time they worked very hard to protect their economic and political interests from the black South African people that had already lived there. And so it got very it got very racist and very discriminatory. There was lots of political pressure from countries around the world. There were economic sanctions against South Africa to try to get them to end their system of apartheid. There was Nelson Mandela. Have you heard of Nelson Mandela? Yeah, Nelson Mandela was a leader of the Black political party in South Africa, kind of pushing for change. He went to jail for quite some time. Finally, was released. They ended apartheid. Nelson Mandela became president for a while, or prime minister, I forget which one. But yeah, for a long time it was a heavily racist system, right? And again, it was very clear what was going on, right? But again, you know, countries like Canada and the U.S. still have some elements of systemic or structural racism here in kind of in our DNA. It's just not quite as obvious to, you know, someone who might just look at it. So here, what do they say? Let me just look at this here. Yeah, so let me just take a look at this. Yeah, I'm just looking right here about halfway down. So structural racism emerges when a dominant group establishes its power, and it's reinforced through inequitable laws, policies, rules, and regulations, and access to resources. So when policymakers either ensure that inequalities are maintained, or when they don't really do anything to fix them, right? So you have a system that is kind of working well for one group, it's not working well for the other group, and often the dominant group will try to keep things the way that they are, right? Because they benefit from it. Did you get to this part? In what ways have Aboriginals been socially isolated in Canada? Did you get there yet? Or no?
Is it the social exclusion part?
Yes.
I think I read a bit of it.
Read a bit of it? Well, maybe what we'll do is we'll press pause on that, because I do want to talk more about Indigenous people in Canada. I want to spend some time kind of getting to know who they are and kind of what has happened here in Canada. But first, I think maybe we'll take a little bit of a break, if that's okay. So let's take a break. When we come back, I will share some things with you that are related to the article that we just read, and then we'll talk a little bit more about systemic racism, okay? So take a quick break, and I'll see you very shortly. Okay, people, we are back. So let me share a few things with you that are related to this article, okay? Now, one of the things that we said is that, sorry, I just hoofed it up the stairs. I gotta catch my breath. One of the things that we said was that racism was created, or the category of race was created as, hang on one second. Okay, sorry. So we said that, race as a category was created kind of in step with colonialism, right? It allowed people to treat other people more poorly, right? And the United States kind of fell into that kind of pattern as well, right? Because if you know anything about the United States was founded in 1774, I think, or 1776. Used to be a British colony, right? Or a series of British colonies. The colonies felt that they weren't treated very well by the British government, and so they rebelled. They fought a little war with Britain because they didn't want to do what Britain said anymore. They won that war, and then they created their own country, right? The United States. And the United States was founded on this principle of freedom and equality and the pursuit of happiness, right? Freedom and justice for all. But of course that wasn't really true, right? Because there were lots of people in the United States that wouldn't be getting freedom and justice and happiness, right? Specifically Indigenous people and black people who had been brought over as slaves and remained slaves. So this kind of freedom and justice for all thing was more like freedom and justice for some, right? So again, how do you resolve this? How do you live in a country where it's freedom and justice for all, and yet you are enslaving people, right? They are literally enslaved. Well, again, the Americans turned to this concept of race, right? And Thomas Jefferson, who was an early US president, I'm not sure which one, maybe the third one or something like that, he owned actually a lot of African slaves. They worked on his farms, and he kind of suggested and kind of did some work trying to establish that there was a science behind it, right? So yes, black Africans were working as slaves for the Americans and sort of making money for them, but that was kind of somehow natural, right? That's okay because the Africans aren't, quite as advanced as the white Americans, right? So there was a few scientists who were kind of working on this kind of thing at the time. One is this guy Blumenbach. He measured a bunch of human skulls. Okay, so he had human skulls from all around the world. He measured them, and based on these measurements, he decided that there were 5 human races. Okay, and so here they are. And so Blumenbach thought there was a Caucasian race, hello, a Mongolian race, a Malayan race, an Ethiopian race, and an American race. And here the American refers to like indigenous people, not American Americans, but Native Americans, if you will. So he measured 60 skulls, and he thought that you could figure out the difference in someone's race based on their skull. But then he kind of went further, right, in talking about what kind of character some of these races had, right? And you can see here that some of his ideas were kind of inspired by biblical teaching, but some of them had no basis in fact whatsoever, right? So here you can see that he felt that the first people created were in fact white, right? They were, he figured Adam and Eve were white, and that all people were originally white, right? God created people in his image. So people who are not white had somehow like degenerated. They had somehow like gotten worse, right? They'd spent too much time in the sun, or they hadn't eaten the appropriate foods, and somehow that damaged them, right? And he felt that if people took care of themselves and, you know, moved to a better environment, they could kind of they could move back to the original race, right? They could become white again. So obviously there's no science to this at all, right? This is based on a biblical teaching, but it's all BS, right? But again, Blumenbach was kind of looking for differences, right? He already had in his idea that the races were different. And so he went about his science trying to prove it. And again, when you already believe something, it's often very easy to prove it, right? Yeah, so this kind of craniometry is what Blumenbach was doing. This kind of craniometry was just one part of kind of race-based science that allowed people to feel good about mistreating other races because it was science, right? Other races were just simply inferior to white people. And again, of course, that's ridiculous and garbage, and there's no truth to that, but you know, in the 17 and 1800s, that's what scientists were thinking, right? But it was also what they believed going in. And again, it's very easy to, you know, if you strongly believe something, your brain will kind of find a way to prove it, unfortunately. The other thing that kind of came out a little bit later is this another pseudoscience about phrenology, right? So the idea here is that you can actually tell what a person is like by looking at the inside of their skull, right? So here you can see, I gotta take off my glasses. You know, here you can see, oh, how cautious someone is. That's number 12, right? If you look at the bumps in that area, you can tell how cautious someone is. You can tell how conscientious someone is, how hopeful they are, how much wonder they have, how ideological, or how ideality, I guess how kind of, you know, how much they look on the bright side, I guess. Their size, their weight, their coloring, right? You can determine all of this by looking at the inside of someone's brain. This is ridiculous. You cannot do this. The parts of the brain in real life do not correspond to any of these things, right? It was a pseudoscience. It was a fake science, right? And sometimes you'll still see things like this as decorations. Have you ever seen one of these? No? Sometimes you'll see them as decorations in Winners. Sometimes if you go into the like decor aisle, you know, people buy little decor items for their house. Sometimes you'll see one of these. Oh, you never been to Winners? Okay. Either way, sometimes you will see these as kind of decorative objects for people's home. They're based on this pseudoscience of phrenology, and there's no truth. They're ridiculous, right? But again, people kind of believe these things because they help them to justify what was happening, right? White people had money and power and were mistreating black people and indigenous people, and that was okay, right? Because those people weren't quite as human as the white Americans, right? They were somehow less, okay? Now, I want to show you something really quickly here, because yesterday I asked you these questions, right? I asked you what race was, and I think we've kind of defined that. But I also asked you what race you were, and could you change races, right? And who gets to say what race you are? And so I just wanted to show you, where is it now? I just wanted to show you a quick video, and so I put the link to it in Microsoft Teams. I just want to show you a quick video that will give us some interesting information on these questions, okay, about how you figure out what race you are, who gets to decide, and can you change races, okay? So again, for online people, the link is in Microsoft Teams. We'll just watch it really quick and then we'll come back. It's only a couple minutes long, all right? So I'll see you in just a few minutes, online people, and we'll talk about what we see, okay? So kind of interesting, right? Because again, we had that question about what race are you and who gets to say. And so in the past, it seems like the US government has kind of flip-flopped, right? And so why do you think why were they changing who was thought of as white? What was the purpose for changing their mind, the government, the US government? Why did they say Mexican immigrants were white and then non-white and then back to white again? why were, yeah, why did the US government change their mind about Mexican immigrants? Why were they sometimes white and sometimes not? So Harry says here it was fitting with their economic policy, right? So, and to take that's correct, Harry. And to take it a little bit further, the he says, yeah, it's really messed up. Yeah, it is, right? It is a little messed up, and it has to do again with the idea that in the United States, at least in the past, being white wasn't simply the color of your skin, right? It was kind of a legal identity, right? You had more rights, you had more privileges, you had better access to resources if you were white, right? And so, why is that? Because prior to the 1960s, the US was a race-based society, right? So just like, hang on a second here.
Honestly, I really think that I'm like, I'm not too much. I'm just really confused because what's the difference? Why is like being white is like a different, you know? Because white people have, I don't know, like it's not, they're not really perfect, you know? You know what I mean? Maybe they have, like, as a, like, maybe having money as a country, yes, but otherwise it's like, I think it's the same as any country, like, yeah.
You think it's the same as any country in that?
It's kind of like people are the same. You know what I mean? The country is different, obviously, but the people are the same. I don't think they're really like, I don't know, like just in case, because you're saying that every, like being white is like, white people are the dominant group in all the, I don't think that.
No, and I probably should have stated that before. I did state it when we started talking about oppression.
Yeah.
But yeah, like we're kind of talking, what we're mostly talking about here is Western countries, right? Because, within this class, there are a lot of different countries represented, and I don't, I don't understand your individual countries well enough to talk about them, right? So, so, so what I'm trying to do here is to kind of show you how things work here, like in the US and Canada and Europe a little bit. And then hopefully you can kind of apply those things to your own country so that you can understand them. Because, for instance, like I don't understand the sort of, culture and, ethnic issues and maybe racial issues in Syria.
I'm
Like
not saying that, I'm not trying to say, I'm saying that, why everyone is like, they wanna be white, why they're saying that, oh,
why do they want to be?
yeah, it's like, white people are really like talking about being white, like, there's no actual difference, it's like,
Yeah, well, that has to do with, you know, that's an oppression thing, right? And oppression is historical, right? And for a good chunk of the most recent history, white people have been involved in colonizing, taking places over. White people have been, or white countries have been dominant economic powers, right, and political powers and military powers. And so in a way, like on a global scale, white people have been kind of the dominant group. And again, as part of the dominant group often gets to sort of determine what things are cool and what things are not, right? And so white people have been able to kind of spread their culture around the world, for better or for worse. And so, yeah, like
maybe like a side element, like economy, yeah, right. But otherwise, I think they're not the best fit. You know what I mean? Because I think every country is as it is,
Yeah.
and there is no other countries that are better than other countries because like it's more depends on the maybe like if they have money or not. But as a whole country, I think because everyone wants the same thing because I don't know they have money or something.
Yeah.
Because I'm not sure like
I completely agree with you.
yeah.
I completely agree with you. But yeah, it's yeah, I completely agree with you. I don't know how to I don't know how to answer that better, but yeah, like I hear what you're saying, and yeah, I think you're right. I think you're right, and I don't entirely understand why people might feel that way either. Yeah. So where were we? Oh yeah. Okay. So yeah. So Mexican immigrants were kind of moved from being white to not white, because again their economic policy, right? And so the U.S. being an American citizen, you've got different rights, different access to resources depending on whether you were white or not. And so yeah, if the US needed workers, suddenly, some people would be classified as white, right? And again, if they didn't need workers, then they would be classified as not white, right? And maybe with Mexican immigrants, maybe that seems strange, but at some points in history, Jewish people were not considered white, Italians were not considered white, Irish people were not considered white, even though Irish people are the whitest of the white, right? But even they weren't considered white. And so here, you have a race, but you also have kind of a social or economic status, right? And so in the US, people would want to establish themselves as white because it would benefit them economically, right? It was better to be classified as a white person than to be classified as a not white person, because you got better privileges, you got better access to resources, right? So here it's a little bit about race, but it's also about having that categorization so that you benefit from it. So lots of people were trying to gain that identity as white so they could benefit from it, right? Whatever that meant for them. But yeah, so, and of course that was happening because the US was a race-based society, right? All of these things were true about the United States, and in some ways they still are. Let me see here. Hi. Sure. So, okay. I think that's all for today. That, that's all for today, people. I'll see you tomorrow, okay?